John tells us that Jesus stood up at a very important festival time in Jerusalem, and he says, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Then rivers of living water will flow from within them." And I think it's very interesting as we look at this proclamation of Jesus to see exactly what he's telling us. Living waters flowing within us. This is Jesus' claim that he is the source for our joy and for our contentment. As John shares this with us, he's asking us, could you use some joy and contentment? So, could you? Jesus is your man. John is telling you that. It's from Jesus that we get that. Now, to understand the depth of what this means, it's really helpful for us to look at these words within the context of the broader scripture. On a previous visit to Jerusalem, Jesus had a conversation with a Jewish leader at night. You remember him, Nick at night. And this Jewish leader was an important individual. And it was words like these, words about living water, that Jesus shared together with Nick. And then, that was in chapter 3. In chapter 4, we see that Jesus has a conversation with a Samaritan woman where he says virtually the same thing that he does to the masses at the temple in Jerusalem. And so here he talks to the masses and he says, if anyone is thirsty. So this living water that Jesus has is for those who are down and out and on the outskirts of society, like this woman in Samaria with her questionable reputation. And this living water that Jesus has is for those who are established and those who are religious and those who are in the mainstream of responsibility and leadership in society. It's for men and it's for women. It's for Jews and it's for non-Jews. It's for the wealthy and it's for the poor. This message of living water is for everybody. If anybody thirsts, Jesus says. And then to really understand even more the depths of this message that he has for us, it's very helpful for us to look at the specific context of when he says this and at what festival he tells us this. This is at the Feast of the Tabernacles. You know, the Jews have 3 major festivals during the year. One is Passover, one is Pentecost, and the other is the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, to understand the Feast of Tabernacles, you just need to know the definition of the word tabernacle. You know what it means? Tent. Remember, there was a tabernacle in the wilderness that they set up? That was their tent, temple, on wheels. They traveled through the wilderness, and everywhere they would set up that tent of the meeting. And all the people would have their tents that they would camp in the wilderness as they journeyed for 40 years after they were slaves in Egypt and before they came into the Holy Land. And so this Feast of the Tabernacles is to help remind the people that you used to be campers out there in the wilderness, but now you have a home here in the Promised Land. And so they would remember that every time that they would come into Jerusalem and set up their tents. Now, there were pilgrims from all over the world, Jewish pilgrims, who would come into Jerusalem and they would set up their tents. This is really a camping holiday. Have any of you ever camped? Got lots of campers? How many of you have camped before? Lots of campers. How many of you still camp? Yeah, I see the way that you camp. You pull that fifth wheel behind you and you pull out that's like a home on wheels. Have any of you camped in the city? I borrowed a motorhome of a friend of mine, and we went up to British Columbia where they had the World Fair. And while we were there at the World Fair, we parked in a gas station parking lot, and then we would walk around the World Fair and participate in all the festivities. It was a lot of fun. We camped in the city. And that's very much of what happened during the Feast of Tabernacle. These pilgrims would come into the city, and they would set up their tents, and they would be all over the city. And it was camping in the midst of the city of Jerusalem. But not only did all these pilgrims from out of town set up their tents, but so did the local folks who lived there. They would also make a tent in their own yard. How many of you have ever camped in your own yard? How many of you have children that have wanted to camp in their yard? There's something very special about kind of getting kind of a change of mind and switching it up and going camping in your own yard. And that's what everybody did during the Feast of the Tabernacles. They would camp in their own yard, and everybody was reminded of the fact that we were once sojourners. We were once campers out in the wilderness with no home. And when they would meet in these tents, they were being reminded of this fact. Now, one of the things that they would do when they put up their tents is they would make their tents out of branches. This was an event that was held during the fall season. And they're trimming their trees a bit. How many of you have trimmed trees so far this year? Okay, you're starting to do that? So there's trimmings of the trees, and so they set up these tents with branches. They make them out of branches where they don't close all the slats, but it's specifically designed so that you could see out through the branches, to be able to look up at the night skies. And the reason that they did that is because they wanted, first of all, to have a little breeze coming through in the heat of the day, because, in the fall it's still hot during the day. But at night, they wanted to have the cover of some branches, but they wanted to also look out. And the parents would tell the children, look, you see those stars there? Those are the same stars under which our forefathers and foremothers traveled in the wilderness. And God, who cared for them, cares for us as well. We have this caring God. And they would learn things from one another. You can learn a lot of things when you go camping. Watson and Sherlock learned a lot from one another when they went camping. You've heard about that, haven't you? They were out camping, and they wake up in the middle of the night, and Watson says to Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson says, "Wake up, Sherlock, what do you see?" He says, "I see millions of stars." He says, yes, but what more do you see?" "Well," he says, "astronomically, I can see that there's millions of galaxies and probably billions of planets. Astrologically, I can tell that Saturn is in Leo. Horologically, I can say that it is 3:30 in the morning. I can say theologically that God is supreme and humans are very, very finite. As I look out here, I can say many things." And Watson said, "Sherlock, is that all you see?" He says, "Well, you tell me what you see, Dr. Watson." And Dr. Watson says, "By Jove, Mr. Sherlock, I think someone's stolen our tent." I love that little silly story because it really says that you can learn different things from different people when you're out camping. Not only do the smart Alex know it all, but the smart Alex can learn some things from the other ones as well. And we learn lots of things. The children teach us with their wonder and their whimsical questions, and we teach them by reminding them of the shortness of life and the beauty of God. I've taken kids out camping, and it's an amazing thing. We go out camping and we're up hiking in the wilderness, and I have on many occasions heard young people say, "God spoke to me." And it's true. When you get away from your problems, you get away from your anxieties, you get away from your cell phone, then you might hear some other voice, and you just might be able to tune yourself to God. And I know that we as adults learn when we go camping. I've told you my wife just got back from her trip, her pilgrimage in Spain. And she says there's something about kind of just readjusting her schedule and getting in a rhythm of walking every day where you're listening to the very voice of God in the midst of your walking. I love the way that the 20th century monk and writer Thomas Merton talks about pilgriming together. He says the geographic pilgrimage is the symbolic acting out of an inner journey. The inner journey is the interpolation of the meanings and the signs of the outer pilgrimage. One can have one without the other, but it is best to have both. You know, the problem that some have is we'll go walking through life, but we'll never take an inner journey. And it's a sad, sad situation. Are we taking time to shake things up on the outside so that God can shake things up on the inside? Are we changing our environment enough so that God can speak to us inside? That's one of the messages that we have, and that's what the holiday of the Tabernacles is all about, and that's where Jesus spoke. Now, some people say, God doesn't speak to me, and my response would be, are you listening? You know, there is a Methodist conference center on the Jersey Shore that is just north of where I used to live in the town of Manasquan, New Jersey. And it is a town called Ocean Grove. And they remind me a lot of this Feast of the Tabernacles because they've established this conference center right on the shore, and they have this tabernacle meeting place in the middle of the town. And then over a period of time, they built this great auditorium. And all around it are these like 100 square foot houses, maybe 150 feet square houses. And on these platforms upon which they built these houses, they put all their stuff inside the houses. But when summer comes, you know what they do? They attach tents to their houses so that they can go camping around the tabernacle. And what they're doing is they're taking time in the summertime to have Bible studies, to listen to Christian speakers, to have Christian concerts, to swim in the cool ocean in the midst of the very hot, humid summers on the Jersey Shore, but also to visit together with other Christians and to have Christian fellowship. It's one of those lovely little communities. There's a community like it on Martha's Vineyard. And there's another one that was actually based on Ocean Grove that is up by Monterey called Pacific Grove. Have you ever been to Pacific Grove? In all these towns, what has happened is around the tabernacle, they have these little tents, but then beyond those tents, these basic Victorian houses, and some of them are small little Victorian houses, but gorgeous little communities have developed. And over a period of time, what happened is some people who really wanted that sense of Christian community would come and would be a part of living in that environment, and others who just wanted to live at the beach would buy those houses. And so in that town, and in many of those towns around the country, it's this mix of sacred and secular. And I think that's much of what happened in the Feast of the Tabernacle as well. This was a fun holiday, camping outside, being together with family, enjoying music. It's kind of like a Woodstock or Coachella kind of event, you know, and everybody's just having a grand old time. But for some people, they really embraced the spiritual dimension of it. And some people got away from the spiritual dimension. It's kind of like some holidays today, Christmas, for example, or Easter, or Passover, or Hanukkah. It's kind of a blend of sacred and secular both. But there was something about that holiday of the Feast of the Tabernacles that was very, very holy, that you couldn't escape the spiritual dimensions of the event. Because every day in that week of the feast, they would have a priest who would be up on this 36-acre Temple Mount. And there at the altar at the temple, he would take this gold pitcher and he would begin to walk down the hill. And it was a very steep journey down. And thousands of people would follow him down the hill into the city of David. And he would get to the pool of Siloam. And when he got to the pool of Siloam, he would dip the pitcher into the pool, and then he would carry that pitcher back up this very steep hill. And as he carried it up the hill, he would get to the very top of the hill. He would go to the base of the altar, and then he would pour out the water on the temple rock right there at the base of the altar. And there was silence while he did that. And every day when he went walking and he got the water, people who followed him back up the hill would go, "Man, this is a steep journey." And they would start complaining. And as they were complaining, they would remember the people in the wilderness who complained. But they would remember how God provided for them water in the wilderness, but how even Moses had complained, and how Moses had even doubted God, and how Moses had even struck the rock with his rod 2 times in anger. And because of that act, he had been restricted from entering into the Holy Land. And a new leader, Joshua, or Yeshua, was the leader into the Holy Land. And so every day people would follow this priest, and every day they would start to complain, but then they would remember, and then they would see the pouring out of the water, and in silence they would watch that. And then after they listened in silence, there would be 3 blasts of a trumpet horn. It was the ram horn. It was the shofar. You know the shofar? So shofar, show good right now. You with me? Follow me, because right after the shofar, there was this proclamation of the book of Isaiah and the words of Isaiah. And they would say this all together from Isaiah 12:3. "With joy you will draw waters from the wells of salvation." Can you say that? With joy you will draw waters from the wells of salvation. One more time. With joy you will draw waters from the wells of salvation. And they said this 7 times. 7 times a priest would pour out the water. 7 times the horn would blast. And 7 times they would declare this. But on the 8th day, the final day of the ceremony, they would go down and do this same thing. The priest would take the waters up to the altar, and before they actually poured the water out, they circled around the altar 7 times in silence, just as they did back when the people of Israel came into the Promised Land. And I imagine that it's probably here where Jesus saw his opportunity to give witness to who he is and what he has for us. Because as they all watched in silence and prepared to declare the words from Isaiah about the living water, Jesus said, "Is anybody thirsty? Let him come to me and drink, and I will provide living water." Text doesn't exactly say that, but it sure suggests something like this is what happens. Because the response is visceral on everyone's part. It's emotional, it's deep. You can feel the response, and people are starting to react. Throughout the book of John, and particularly here in chapter 7, Jesus is called many different things. He's a miracle worker. He's a wizard. He's a great orator. He's a prophet. He's a Messiah, but you have to define exactly what you mean by Messiah. And everybody starts debating, who is this Jesus who's making these claims about himself? And it's right in the midst of this debate, in verse 50, near the end of this chapter, that John brings up a man who he has talked about earlier. And this is just one of two other times he's appeared in the text. He says, Nicodemus spoke up in the midst of the debate, and Nicodemus came to the defense of Jesus. And everybody put him down. And it's not like John is saying Nicodemus is this bold believer and disciple of Jesus, but he is at least saying that Nicodemus is one of the people who's embraced the meaning of a pilgrimage and is living out the real spiritual purpose of the Feast of the Tabernacles, because he's taking time for an inner journey and he's reflecting on who Jesus is for him. I think it's very telling that the great artist Michelangelo, who was preparing a grave marker for his own grave, made an image of Jesus, the crucified Christ, being carried to his own tomb. And one other place in the book of John, John mentions Nicodemus one other time, and it's when he went with Joseph of Arimathea to take the body of Jesus to the tomb. And when Michelangelo did that image, for the face of Nicodemus, he put his own face. And in that way was bearing witness to the fact that he himself was on a pilgrimage. This is one of the things that Jesus is inviting us into. What do you say about Jesus? What difference does he make? Who do you say he is? Now, John makes no bones about it. John tells us right from the very beginning of his gospel that Jesus is one with the eternal God, our Creator. He tells us that he is God in the flesh who has come to, get the word, he uses this exact word in John 1, to tabernacle among us. And he gives to us an invitation to come and to find contentment in him and to let God camp out in our life.